Secretary to the Treasury during the Trump administration, Monica Crawley, told us this is not a prosecution, it's a persecution.
He delivered a booming economy and world peace. And in so doing, Nigel, he created a vast swath of enemies in the deep state, the administrative state, the propaganda press, and among the globalists. And from moment one, because he posed such an existential threat, they needed to try to destroy him. What you're seeing today is a very sad moment for the United States. It is a political persecution. This is not a prosecution.
Well, crowds of supporters and those who are against the former president have been gathering outside court.
It's a historic day where finally somebody with so much power, the ex-president, is going to be arrested and hopefully held accountable for his crimes against women.
It's trying to take this misdemeanor, turn it into a felony, and now tie it in with the federal election crimes. And it's just, that's not what America is about. You don't make up new laws to target someone.
I'm here because Trump needs to be held accountable for one of the many crimes he's committed. And I'm here in support of democracy because I think he's a threat to it.
Let's go to our political editor, Darren McCaffrey, who's live for us in New York. Darren, this is history in the making. Can you summarise today's events and what the atmosphere has been like where you are?
Yeah, an extraordinary image, as you say, an historic day here in the United States. A New Yorker, Donald Trump, former president, the first former president, or indeed current president, ever to be charged with a criminal offence, arrested at around 2 p.m. local time, 7 p.m. your time, when he turned up at Manhattan Criminal Court. And in the last couple of minutes, he has had the charge sheet read out against him, 34 charges in total around business fraud, including the charge of hush money payments to two women, we believe. He pleaded not guilty in that courtroom. It was a very short meeting, only around 15-20 minutes or so. The expectation is that he will now be put on bail. He will leave that courthouse and indeed leave New York. He'll travel back to Florida, to Mar-a-Lago tonight, where he will speak to his supporters down there. As you've suggested, this is a process, though, that is going to take some time. This is not going to be concluded in the next couple of weeks or months. It could well take into next year. And there is a big question about how it will play into the next US general election. Donald Trump portraying this today as a witch hunt against him. The New York State saying that it clearly has got evidence of a crime and that this is due process, and that irrespective of anyone, no one is above the law, and that they will prosecute the former president in this way. But in the end, it is a moment that the United States has never seen before. That moment of Donald Trump looking glum, not looking too happy, sat in courtroom 15 of the Manhattan Criminal Court within the last couple of minutes.
Yeah, Darren, I've heard reports and seen still images all over news agencies that describe Donald Trump as looking emotionless. Now, it wasn't a surprise that he was going to plead not guilty, but his supporters and Donald Trump, who launched his Republican nomination campaign in Texas just over a week ago, saying, that this was not true, that it was not due process. Do you think his supporters are going to be happy that he's pled not guilty today?
Yeah, they'll be pleased because they want him to be exonerated, and that's something that his lawyers, Bethany, have repeatedly said that they will do, that they will fight this battle fiercely, as they put it. Clearly, protesters have gathered. Not masses, hundreds of them, I would suggest, outside the courthouse today. They're pretty angry, though, and they're pretty vocal about this. They do feel that it is a witch hunt, that this is politically motivated, that it's been led by a man who was elected as a Democrat as a district attorney here in New York. But clearly there are a lot of people here in the United States as well who do not like Donald Trump, who feel that no one should be above the law, and that if he has committed a crime, that it should be tested in courts. Politically, though, this at the moment seems to have played into the hands of Donald Trump. We know that he's received around $7 million in donations over the last couple of days since this indictment was announced. His support amongst Republican voters seems to have increased. He's pulled well ahead of Ron DeSantis, the Florida governor, who's widely viewed as his kind of main opponent potentially in the next election. But the bigger question is, what about the rest of the United States? Because for many people here in America, they want to see the drama of Donald Trump come to an end. They're bored, essentially, of the headlines and the news coverage. And frankly, they're not going to get that over the next couple of months or indeed the next couple of years, because this is not the only criminal charges that Donald Trump may well face. He could well face criminal charges in Georgia, or indeed around documents that were found, White House documents, confidential documents, in his Florida home at the end of last year.
Our political editor, Darren McCaffrey, live in New York for us. Darren, thank you very much for that update. Now, you're up to date on GB News. Now it's time for Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Hello, good evening. I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, and this is State of the Nation Tonight. As you've heard, Donald Trump is currently facing 34 trumped-up charges in a case demonstrating why the British judicial system is far superior to the American one, even though they tried to base it on ours. Whilst there is a certain propensity for judicial activism in this country, it doesn't come close to the politicised judiciary and prosecutors in the United States. It used to be believed that marsupials only existed in Australasia, but in a matter of weeks, they've been found both in the continent of Europe and North America. Mr. Trump came out today and he stole my line. He called it a kangaroo court, and I'm inclined to agree. Politics, like in Boris's case, is being played out in a courtroom. I'm joined now by an excellent panel ideal to discuss this. Former Blair advisor John McTernan and the political commentator and consultant, and indeed former Chief of Staff to David Cameron, Alex Dean. John, do you think this is a good way to develop politics in any country?
I do think that you have to say that nobody is above the law. And if Donald Trump has broken the law, he shouldn't be able to say, because I'm a politician, because I was president, because I'm going to run for president again, the laws don't apply to me. You know, be you ever so high, the law has to be above you.
And that's absolutely right. But doesn't it stick in the craw when the prosecutor is an elected political opponent and make fair-minded people think this isn't justice, this is politics?
Well, it is the American settlement that they have directly elected prosecutors. That's the way they do it, and they've done it since for the last century at least, and probably beyond that. Yes, there's a political position. People run for them from political backgrounds. But this prosecutor, Alvin Bragg, looked at the file when he came in and set it to one side. He said, we can't proceed on this basis. So he has actually he took one step back away from this, that they inherited from his predecessor, looked at it again in some forensic detail. And the fact is that some Trump associates have had to go to jail. It suggests, you know, either Donald Trump knew nothing about what was going on, being done on his behalf, or he knew. And if you are party to a crime, you can't just get away from it just because you're being prosecuted by a Democrat. If it was a Republican, would he just put his hands up and go, it's okay?
But, Alex, isn't it always the case that people say piously that they're leaving their politics at the door? But this is always nonsense, that people's politics runs through them, particularly when they're elected on a party ticket.
I'm afraid that's a criticism of the system, not of the man or of the case. I agree with John. I wouldn't elect our prosecutors, I wouldn't elect our judges, and I think there's much to criticise about a system that does that. But once you have it, that system still has to go through, evaluate evidence and bring cases where it's appropriate. Now, I haven't been at the bar for some time now, but I still remain with the firm view that the process in this country is better than what we're seeing on show in the United States. But, you know, in the end, they've got to go through the process of evaluating a prosecution and bring it. And by the way, I'm far from sure I agree with Dermot's conclusion that people want to see the end of this. I think this escalates Trump rather a lot. And there's plenty of people who will look at this, see how it dynamises the Trump base, see how it drives up support for him amongst Republicans. It definitely means
done for Ron DeSantis.
Exactly. It's definitely going to mean he dominates the field for the selection once again. I think he's odds on to get the nomination, no matter how good, whatever you think of it. And this, I think, probably helps that. So I'm actually more inclined to think this isn't some kind of conspiracy, because if you thought about it, you probably wouldn't. If you were planning it on a partisan basis, you wouldn't have done it
this way.
But US partisanship has become so extreme that Democrats can't believe that Republicans will behave in this way. That they think that if they prosecute Trump, that finally does him down, and this anti-establishment figure, this figure that the blob doesn't like, will be put to sleep.
I agree with that, but those are also all reasons that will energise and incentivise Trump supporters to rally behind him. I'm not encouraging that necessarily or criticising it. I'm simply saying all of this escalates Trump, raises his salience in the campaign, makes it more likely that he's Biden's opponent. And for me, in the end, this is the weakest of the charges that Trump faced. If you were planning something against Trump, you wouldn't have brought this one first.
But doesn't it further embitter the political system in the US? And couldn't the Republicans say, well, look, we could prosecute Hillary Clinton for her dodgy emails. Once Biden's out of office, we can prosecute him for his documents being in his garage in Delaware. That this just changes the whole tone of the debate if you're going for minor administrative charges.
Well, the US system has become more divided. It has become more partisan. There used to be a lot more working across the aisle. There used to be a lot more collaboration, cooperation. Biden comes from that generation, actually, of where a Democrat senator would work across the aisle to get legislation done the right way. You know, McCain did too. I think that time has gone, the 20th century cooperation. What you have to have is something has to change in the country. I've got no doubt about that. When Trump was 7 million votes behind in the general election, he wasn't close, but he was close in the Electoral College. That's partly what this is about. That's partly what one of the charges is about, which is it was close enough that if he'd managed to change the vote in Georgia, then he would have been maybe president. And that, the bitterness of the fighting over the Electoral College, that is there too. But Trump represents something. Trump represents a strand in politics. And the generation after Biden, the Democrats, has to find a way to reach across and to heal. And
that's what Biden promised to do when he got elected, and he singularly failed to do it. He's been even more divisive than before. There's been no real attempt.
Well, the one thing you'd have to give him credit for is he hasn't really got a majority in the Senate. He's got the casting vote. He had the casting vote of the vice president. He's got Joe Manchin. He's got to work with. He's managed to push through quite strong and powerful Democrat policies like the Inflation Reduction Act, with its investment in decarbonising the economy. It's pushed that through in a way that other presidents wouldn't have been able to do, Democrats. But
he did have a majority, because with the casting vote he had a majority to get things through. He can't get anything through now. Now he's lost the House, he can't get anything through. But it's hard to say he's made American politics less divisive. I mean, he's almost as divisive as Trump. To Trump supporters, he is pretty toxic.
Look, I agree with what John said about. I've been surprised by what the Biden administration's managed to get through Congress, given the scenario. Whether you agree with the policies or not, I've been surprised by that. On the divisiveness, he's pursued a Democrat agenda, which I personally would not have voted for. If I was in the United States, I'd vote Republican. But I mean, it's recognisably mainstream Democratic agenda that is certainly to the right of many of his critics in the House, AOC and co. He's in some ways a throwback. The trouble they're going to have if they ever get to oppose Biden, it looks like Biden's going to run again, age 104 or whatever he is. If Biden runs again, and his dream is that it's Trump, because if it's someone a generation or two younger, he's going to look ridiculous. But if Biden runs again,
a youngster in their 70s,
that is exactly, you're just coming into their prime. That is the one hope for the Biden administration is that Trump is the opponent, therefore he won't look ridiculous as the candidate. And the one hope for the Democrats is by the time Biden does finish, they've got someone sensible to replace him, because right now they don't.
We're certainly not Kamala Harris.
No, and that's part of the reason. If they had a normal mainstream vice president, in any normal circumstances, the pressure would be very significant on the incumbent right now to stand down and let their vice president become president and have a good run into the 2024 election. That won't happen because the Democrats don't trust Harris.
And what lessons are there, if any, for the UK from this?
Well, don't start movements where we politicise our judiciary or our prosecutors any further. And we have done quite significantly in recent times with hate crimes, which give wide latitude to people people about whether you should prosecute someone for their thoughts, or at least treat their offences as being aggravated by dint of what you think their thoughts might be, and drawing the judiciary into making political decisions. But in the end, in looking at the United States, not that we should feel complacent, we can take some satisfaction from being British and having a system that is far more rational, in my view, than what we're seeing played out right now. But if I were criticising the Americans, it wouldn't start with the judiciary or their prosecutors. It would start with their political environment. Right now, you're in an environment where impeachment becomes far more likely than it was in past generations. Impeachment used to be a once-in-a-century kind of thing. I imagine the next president, whoever he or she may be, will be impeached.
But that's where we are following the footsteps in the building over there with this ridiculous treatment of Boris Johnson, which is the similar trying to bring a legal approach to a fundamentally political issue.
So the issue in the UK, I think, to be honest, is the House of Commons trying to fight for the importance of the legislature over the executive. And I think that, I've been part of an administration in which I think the executive rode roughshod over the legislature, and I don't think it's good. I think the House of Commons should be the highest court in the land. I think it's important that the House of Commons is able to police itself and the behaviour of members. And so I actually think, whatever one thinks of the merits of the case, the Johnson case, one way or another, I think it's important that the Commons makes judgments on its own members. And this is, it's a committee with a majority of Conservative MPs. So I think that is the system, however imperfect you may think it's working on this case, it's the system working properly.
There is, I think, one thing to point out is the difference between us and the Americans. Our legislature, when it has its elections, then produces the executive from within its own body. That's fundamentally different from the executive, from the president on down. Yeah. And it does at least have the virtue of clarity. Yeah. I'm not arguing for a presidential system, but I'm merely making the point that in their system, if the president falls out with Congress, they both have mandates electorally and politically. You do wind up with situations here where someone's fallen on the wrong side of the will of the House or the opinion of the House,
and that person's out.
And if that person's out, then they're denied all the protections of, patronage and office and so forth, and then the wolves can really get at them.
Well, and indeed, and Boris left office because of that. To come back to Trump, how much do you think British people care? Because I'm not convinced my voters in North East Somerset will be thinking that Donald Trump is head of their concerns. I think they'll be thinking they're concerned about the cost of living crisis, they're concerned about domestic political issues.
Donald Trump adds to the gaiety of the nation, I think.
Because we laugh at Americans, well, so at least it's not that bad here.
There's been a few decades now in which celebrity has become more and more integrated into politics and celebrity, and the narratives of the soap opera have come in, and the rise and fall of politicians. Donald Trump is a supreme character actor. He came from reality TV. He's a president, like he's on reality TV, and just as people probably shouldn't be that interested in Love Island, they're fascinated by it. And this is a version of, it's a presidential Love Island.
I have a slightly different perspective. I think in this country, a very narrow slice of the left is obsessed with Trump, hates him, spent 4 years calling every Tory, when they did anything remotely on the right, Trumpian, and that
That's very Trumpian of you.
Exactly. And then a very small slice on the right, which adores him and says it's fantastic. And those two slices are wildly overrepresented in social media and, dare I say it, commentary.
Well, I completely agree with that. I don't think there are any votes in commentary on the American political system.
No, I agree with that, although there can be harm if you get drawn into being seen as defending one side or the other. But the difference I was going to point out is that he is still a viable candidate for the presidency of the United States, unquestionably the most important job in the world, and to that extent, he's of interest to us all.
Yes.
Well, he's got a very important job, and our relationship with the United States is our most important foreign affairs relationship, obviously. But it sometimes seems to be very much one where we are always the supplicant.
Well, Britain and the United States have a special relationship, not least because the United States left the United Kingdom in quite a brutal and violent way. But we have had since the war, the partnership in NATO is not just a partnership in a treaty organisation, it's a partnership probably best shown by a nuclear deterrent, which is a joint and shared endeavour, to create a deterrent which works our scientists, our military work on both sides on this, and the Americans work here, we work there. I think that the binding together, and that's a cross-party agreement to actually, for Britain and America to have this joint military capacity. Yes, America's always going to be the bigger partner in that, but imagine NATO without America and without Britain. It's the fact
it wouldn't exist without America. I mean, there would be no NATO. NATO has shown its worth in terms of the NATO guarantee post the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Yeah, I don't accept your premise about being supplicants. I think that America finds the partner, and I work for American listed business, I spend a fair amount of time there, and certainly talking to their politicians, it's plain that America needs Britain in the world. And I would just make one, you know, the world of finance more than me, but, there's no closer financial centres in the world than London and New York. The relationship is, they invest, they are our biggest investor. We are their biggest investor. And then, fascinatingly, the figure may have changed, not least because of Biden's so-called Inflation Reduction Act, which is rampant
Nothing
protectionism.
to do with inflation.
Yeah, exactly, rampant protectionism. So the figure may have changed, but for many years, because of the difference in the way we calculated things, they claimed to operate a small trading surplus with us.
Yes,
we claimed to operate a small trading surplus with them. It was absolutely
something must be good. Yeah.
Yes, it's the perfect trading relationship because both sides think they're on the winning part of it. Yes, and therefore both sides have continued to be happy
that ain't
with
supplicant.
it. And they are our biggest individual national trading partner, which people forgot in the European argument, because the EU as a whole is, but no individual European country is as important as the US, even without a trade deal. So I don't know if there's any news on Trump. I mean, I think he's just hanging about in the court waiting to come out.
He's going to find, and so I haven't prosecuted or defended in a while, but he's going to find that there are certain things that nobody can overcome. Court bureaucracy is one of them. Be you never so high, you're going to have to wait, sit in a waiting room at some point.
You have to wait till the process is over. Yeah, you're not leaving yet, mate.
Which will take its time as it wishes to. But if he ends up, and we can talk freely about it, unlike anything that's going on in our courts, where we couldn't say anything without risking being in contempt of court. We can say whatever we like. We can say it's innocent, we can say it's guilty, we can prejudice the trial, and it's all a free-for-all, partly because it's a foreign jurisdiction. But even in the US, the Free Speech Amendment allows you to say pretty much anything. But I've read that if he were to end up going to prison, he'd still have his civil service his Secret Service with him.
Good grief, imagine this. Now, see, one of your guests earlier, one of Nigel Farage's guests earlier, said that if you wrote this script for Hollywood, no one would believe it. That's the sequel. The president goes to prison and still has his Secret Service detail with him.
But he can also run for president from prison.
Yes.
So he could actually...
It's a communist didn't he? Alf Landon?
Somebody,
a far left-winger did during the Roosevelt era. That's right.
Yeah.
And you used to be able to in this country, and we only changed the law after Bobby Sands, because he obviously ran for Parliament from prison, and indeed won. And then the law was changed to make it impossible to run for Parliament from prison.
Yeah. Now, what I don't know about this delay is whether he's actually waiting to get the all-clear to go out onto the street. Because one of the things that the Trump circus brings with it is a remarkable escalation in security. And I've noted that not only were there huge numbers of TV crews around the court, but the number of police officers and protesters and counter-protesters was huge. The point being, there was a time there, it wasn't that long, but there was a time there when it felt Trump was slightly in the wilderness and slightly out of the political circus. I think he would probably, and those advising him probably, would rather it was like this, and all the microphones were there, all the cameras were there, than he was slightly out of the news.
And the question is, is he going to speak when he comes out, or is he going to speak from Mar-a-Lago? Like, how long is it going to, another... Well,
one of the online newspapers said he was going to do it once he got home to Florida. But our political editor, Darren McCaffrey, I think, is on the line and has got more to say to us. What's going on? What are we waiting for? I mean, we're getting a bit bored with waiting. Can they hurry up, please?
It's a really good question, actually. I think one of your guests probably touched on it quite astutely there, talking about court bureaucracy. There was an expectation President Trump as he went into the courtroom. That clearly didn't happen. I think the expectation now is that we're not really going to hear from him until he flies to Florida. And that is what we think is now going to happen, that he's going to leave the court and pretty much travel straight to the airport to get on that plane to speak to his supporters down in Mar-a-Lago. But he didn't look very happy in that courtroom. I'm not entirely sure whether it was just the very fact that he was hearing the detail for the very first time, or the situation he found himself in courtroom 15 of Manhattan's criminal court, but facing 34 counts of falsifying business records and conspiracy against 2 payments, we reckon, of hush money to 2 different women in the 2016 presidential campaign. Him, of course, in pleading not guilty. He is now leaving the courtroom. So having said what's holding him up, and you wanted him to hurry up, Jacob, maybe he got the message. He's now leaving the courthouse. As you say, there are hundreds of the supporters gathered outside, hundreds and hundreds of journalists. I was there this morning. Quite extraordinary, the media interest in all this. He is leaving that courtroom, leaving it now after what was a relatively short hearing, only around 30-40 minutes or so. But we're waiting for him to come out of that courthouse. He's going to get into that motorcade that has escorted him around New York over the last day or so. And as I say, we haven't had it confirmed, but the expectation is he's going to head back to the airport, get back on his plane and head back to Florida. But what an extraordinary day, Jacob. An extraordinary image, yes. An historic day of seeing a US president in a courtroom charged with 34 different criminal offences.
Yeah, no, it's certainly been an amazing day in American politics, and it really is politics rather than legal as far as I can tell. And thank you for your excellent commentary. It was beginning to sound like a cricket commentary as he was coming out and getting into the car. I was just waiting to see whether the ball would take spin on this particular wicket. It's certainly a sticky wicket for Donald Trump. But we won't know until later whether anything is emerging from this courtroom, will we?
No, I mean, we've not got the details, and the big question, I think, for Donald Trump is just how much he's going to be allowed to talk about this. We think, again, we do not know, we think that the judge may well have said that Donald Trump needs to rein in, particularly his social media posts. He's widely attacked the judge in this case. He's widely attacked also the district attorney.
He's getting into the car. It looks a bit like a Black Mariah waiting for him.
Altogether, leaving the courthouse down there in Lower Manhattan Criminal Court. He's getting into the car. As I say, we don't know, but we think he's heading probably back to LaGuardia Airport, where his jet is on the runway, waiting to take him to the airport. We've not really got very close to him. I mean, I've been stood outside the courthouse and indeed Trump Tower over the last 24 hours or so. We only can view him from a distance, such as the security here. Lots of roads closed off in New York. Thousands of NYPD police officers who've been called up to ensure that this all passed off peacefully, which to date it most certainly has, even if there has been protesters on both sides, pretty angry, pretty vocal, but peaceful so far. So he will get into that motorcade.
America
One of the
likes,
reasons he wasn't, of course, handcuffed.
But America likes this over-exaggerated security, doesn't it? It likes to have hundreds of people where we would have a few bobbies just quietly looking on. Well, they do also assassinate their presidents.
I share that relaxed position.
I think the risk assessment is actually based on reality.
Yeah. I think pound for pound, it's the most dangerous job in the world, if you consider the number of presidents who've been assassinated. So.
And it is extraordinary how quickly protection is taken from former ministers who would be terrorist targets, former Home Secretaries, people who would be a great prize.
I think the Tsar of Russia was considerably more dangerous. There's a wonderful line about it being a dictatorship tempered by assassination. Anyway, he's now being driven off, so you can see the pictures. I always think these are rather interesting when you see prime ministers going off to
Pointless. I hate
Palace.
Helicopter days in Westminster. I think the explanation apparently is that our broadcasters block book days and then have to use them at some point. Right? So a drop of a hat, get the helicopter up, get the bird in the sky.
One of our 12 days.
Quite macho, get the bird in the sky.
I rather like the story of Attlee becoming prime minister when he was driven by his wife to Buckingham Palace because there was no security and no government-provided car at that point.
You used to be able to walk down Downing Street.
As a child, yes, as a child I was able to. That's right.
I like the story of Attlee. He used to travel into the House of Lords on the Tube, the Central Line, and one day somebody leant over to him and said, "You look a lot like Clement Attlee," and he said, "I get that all the time."
Get that all the time.
That's very good. It's almost as good as one where somebody said to the late Queen, "You look very like the Queen," and she said, "How very reassuring." That's another excellent. And that great story of her security man, yes, that he gave after she died.
That was a beautiful story.
It's funny.
She was a very witty woman.
She certainly was.
Loads of quotes from her. Great.
Yes, well, that's the one advantage of having monarchy is you don't get your monarchs dragged in front of the courts in this way. They certainly can't have committed electoral fraud, can they? Because they're not up for election.
They can't.
Charles I might have a quibble with you on that one.
That court wasn't valid.
I know it wasn't valid. That was I sometimes go to the ceremony to celebrate Charles the Martyr.
Oh, do you?
Yes, I do.
I have a relic from his execution. I have a handkerchief that was dipped in his blood. So if you ever come and visit me, I will show it to you.
Good grief.
Yeah, it was General Penruddock, I think, was the man's name, and it came out of auction a few years ago, and I got it. One of my very prized possessions.
The greatest abuse I've ever had on Twitter, and I've had a lot of abuse on Twitter, was when I tweeted the placing of the wreath on the statue and said, "To our martyr king." And I got pelters from everywhere.
Well, you're
the worst attacks I've ever
GBNews
had.
you go from Donald Trump to Charles the Martyr.
Charles King and Martyr.
But I'm with you.
But the mad people on Twitter do get exercised by all sorts of strange things.
Twitter isn't real life.
Absolutely. It's why politicians mustn't take Twitter too seriously. And if the judge in Manhattan has been saying to Donald Trump, you mustn't to say too much on social media, that seems to me completely ridiculous, because who cares about social media? Darren, you think he has been told not to say too much on social media, is that right?
Well, really interestingly, we know at least that the prosecutors were suggesting to the judge that should be the case. We're told that during that brief hearing, where President Trump was sat in the courtroom, they said to the judge that Trump's social media posts were irresponsible and threatening, and they're seeking an order in order to try and rein that in, if you like. I mean, he has been pretty vocal in describing not just this as a witch hunt, but attacking the lead prosecutor, the district attorney of Manhattan, though it must be said, you know, he's a political figure in himself. He was elected as a Democrat here, and also the judge as well. So we'll have to see how that does play out. But clearly there is a sense this is meant to be a criminal trial. You know, there is a sense that this shouldn't be prejudiced, though.
But how worried are Americans about this if a registered Democrat, an elected Democrat, can say that a presidential candidate cannot use social media? Isn't that undermining the First Amendment? And do Americans feel that way, or do they think this is just a normal criminal trial?
Well, I think this is kind of the tension that you guys have been talking about in the studio, that, you know, what you have is a highly politicized judicial system here in the United States. You've also got the First Amendment, which is the right to freedom of speech, and those sometimes do clash. At the end of the day, the district attorney, the New York state, would suggest that there has to be due process, that there has to be a criminal trial, that there will be a jury potentially involved in all of this, that it cannot be prejudiced. And yet at the same time, Donald Trump would argue that he should be allowed to use that First Amendment right, the right to free speech, to express how he feels. He would argue this is not a simply judicial process, this is the political process against him. And I think that is going to play out in the days, weeks, months to come. And we have to remember, this is not going to come to an end anytime soon. This is a process that's going to drag out for months and months, potentially into next year too. And it'll be interesting to see what the public reaction to that is. We know in recent days, Jacob, that support for Donald Trump has actually increased quite significantly amongst Republicans, who will get to decide whether he is their next nominee for the US president. However, there is a counter view here that actually lots of Americans outside of maybe the core supporters of Donald Trump are quite bored about this. They don't want the drama on an endless cycle, and that in the long run could do the former president quite a lot of damage. So it's quite a difficult moment, but it is an historic moment, an extraordinary day. And as he heads back off to Florida, we'll get a sense of what he has to say later on when he speaks to his supporters and indeed some of the press at Mar-a-Lago a little later, in the middle of the night where you are, but around 8 p.m, 9 p.m. US time.
Right. Well, I'm sure that will be an exciting moment for people who are still awake or are living in the United States. But some people have been mailing Mogg. Thank you very much. I hadn't given the address out today, which from memory is mailmog at GBnews something. And Margaret.uk. I hear in my ear a mystery voice comes across from the ether and says .uk. Margaret says, he was never my favourite person, but this drama shames America. And Margaret uses 3 exclamation marks, so I think she feels this quite strongly. Peter says, this is a question for John, does your Labour guest think that a senile old man like Biden is a good president? Trump is the best president for years. He only has 1 exclamation mark, so on the Richter scale of exclamation marks, that's lesser than Margaret. And Neil, Trump offered the UK a trade deal after the Brexit vote, but the Conservative government didn't want it. Well, that sounds very disappointing. What do you say about a senile old man like Biden?
I think a man who has a stammer is not senile. A man who is the only elected official to have ever beaten Donald Trump should be respected. He won a contest fair and square. Nobody in the Republican Party has ever beaten Trump, and nobody else in the Democrat Party has beaten Biden.
I don't dispute his right to be president. That's correct, and he won the election fair and square. And your point about him being the only person beating Trump is a fair one. The problem is, though, it's worse than a stammer, isn't it? And I think it's apparent to most of us. If you compare speeches from Biden in his prime in the Senate in the 70s and 80s, when he was a firebrand, there was someone who was fluent, thoughtful, quick off the mark, able to engage in rapier-like debate. That is not the president.
He certainly gets very confused about the teaching of the Catholic Church, where his views are not in the least bit orthodox.
Jacob, I've got to tell you, that's a generous thing to focus on. I think he gets confused about much more basic things than that. And
he's a decent working-class, blue-collar Catholic.
Oh, that's why he won. He's certainly a decent man, John. I'm not disputing that either. And as I've been saying earlier, the fact he's far more mainstream in the democratic movement offers me some comfort and solace, given some of the people who are in that party and prominent, increasingly prominent.
And he was chosen by He was chosen really by the African-American voters.
He was chosen by his party, and I don't dispute that, and then he won the election, and I don't dispute that. The point is, Joe Biden could have been a fine president. The trouble is he came far too late to office.
Look, I think the Clinton machine persuaded the Obama machine that it was Hillary's turn, and I think if Obama had allowed Biden to run, Trump would have been beaten the first time round by Biden.
I think that's right.
And a younger Biden would now have been handing over. So
I think that's right. You're being more polite than I am, but I suppose my premise is he's going downhill pretty quickly. And I think if he'd come to office 4 years earlier, I think he'd have been a much more cogent person. In choosing Hillary Clinton, the Democrats did this remarkable thing. I think they picked one of the very few people who could lose an election to Donald Trump.
Yes. I'm hearing that there may be a press conference coming soon, but I think it might be a good time now to start talking about Nigel Lawson, who sadly died today, and we'll come back to Donald Trump later if there is a press conference. Nigel Lawson was an absolute titan in terms of British political life, probably the most important Chancellor of the Exchequer of this century. I mean, there's an argument in favour of Chamberlain, and then before him there's an argument in favour of Gladstone, and before him of Pitt. But he is up there with the truly great chancellors. And why was this? Why was Nigel Lawson so transformative, so fundamentally different from those who had gone before? Well, it's because he understood economics and had the intellectual confidence to dominate the Treasury. I remember speaking to him once, and he told me about the economic forecasts for his budget in 1988, when he famously cut taxes from 60% to 40%. And he said he got the forecasts from the Treasury, and he looked at them, and he thought they weren't good enough to come out with the figures that he needed, so he increased growth by 1%. And lo and behold, the figures all added up, and he was right. And this is the key. He had the intellectual confidence in his basic political beliefs, but he also did the homework before. So as Financial Secretary to the Treasury, as Energy Secretary, he was also building the platform for the tax cuts that came, that he ensured that the budget was kept in order, that spending was cut, that what the state did was lessened, a fundamentally conservative approach to governing. And he also saw that getting the state out of people's business by privatising things would give the government more room for manoeuvre, because investment of business would not be determined by the needs of the welfare state or of the NHS or of the education service. So the privatisations of British Telecom, of British Gas and so on were very much led by Nigel Lawson. And this made the platform for him to cut taxes. And I believe it's true that in every single one of his budgets, he managed to abolish an individual tax, including, as it happens, the dog licence, which was one of the ones that he abolished. And by doing this, he was able to raise more money and grow the economy because he understood that the Laffer curve actually worked. And this set the platform for, as I was saying, decades of economic growth. That the reason the economy grew basically through to 2008 was because of the basis left by Nigel Lawson, a terrific, heroic chancellor, a great man, requiem aeternam Dei Domine, lux perpetua lucede, requiescat in pacem. Amen. Now I get back to my panel on Nigel Lawson. Do you not agree that he was the most important chancellor post-war?
So certainly of my lifetime, and I was born in the 70s, but I agree with your premise, I think, that he was the most important post-war chancellor. I would just make one extra point to the ones you were rehearsing, which is that he remained keen to be involved in the politics of his time. After he came out from office, he didn't regard himself as someone who should just accept the plaudits which he richly deserved from his time in office. He was, for example, one of the luminaries of the movement to take this country out of the European Union. There was a time when the Vote Leave, the Leave campaign, was in pretty based in this building, by the way, in which we sit today, was in pretty choppy circumstances. And Lawson lent his name, lent his credibility, and lent his capacity to persuade to it, and became its chairman at a time when it desperately needed heavyweight mainstream voices. And I thought that was demonstrated the salience that he continued to have. And I think that for whatever else his qualities or faults, David Cameron said yesterday that 20 years after Lawson left the Treasury, people would still say, what would Lawson do? And I think that's to the measure of the man.
Yes, I think that's right, and I think many of us forget, actually, the important role he played in Brexit, because he was the first big political figure who was widely respected to come out and say, I think in an article for The Times, that leaving the European Union was the right thing to do. And John, do you think that was a pivotal moment for Brexit? I know you're not a great fan of it, but...
It definitely gave momentum to Brexit, there's no doubt about that. He was wrong on that, and everybody's right to be has the right to be wrong. I think it's a shame that Lawson couldn't stop the poll tax. I think the poll tax.
He did try.
He tried very hard. He was against it.
I know, he kept his name off the face of the bill, which nobody noticed. And for a finance bill, which it was, to not have the Chancellor Exchequer's name on the face of it, it shows a lack of attention to detail amongst the lobby and amongst the opposition not to spot that. I think, yes, a radical reforming Chancellor. He did, however, leave to the UK levels of inequality we didn't have before, and I think that has to be
halved unemployment.
And the levels of inequality, the levels of inequality.
But the rich getting richer, as long as the less well off are also getting richer. If it diverges, that doesn't matter. Everyone was getting richer.
The divergence does matter because in a sense the inequality.
It really doesn't.
The inequality was the driver of Brexit.
The thing that led to the greatest narrowing of inequality was the collapse of markets in 2008. If you smash up your economy, you reduce inequality. If you grow your economy, inequality grows to start with, but everybody's getting better off, and that's the essence.
The biggest inequality in a society, outside of the margin of the tremendously vulnerable, some society, any caring society is always going to need to look after a very, very small group of people who simply can't care for themselves. Outside of that group, the biggest inequality is the ability to work for yourself and provide for yourself or not. And Lawson, in his time as Chancellor, halved unemployment. He started with 3 million and took it all the way down with all the economic challenges that they had to 1.5.
And then it returned to 3 million again, which was the legacy that carried through into the latter part of the Tory government. He was a big figure. He could argue his point, and I think having an intellectual framework is really important in politics. Having an analysis is one of the most empowering things for any politician. If I disagree with you, Jacob, which I do on many things, We at least disagree because we both have different frameworks of analysis. We have a view of the world. Too many people, too many modern politicians don't have a view of the world. They try to find out what the world's thinking through focus groups, try to follow the world. You shouldn't follow the world. You should lead the world. You should shape the world. And there's a sense in which, we're coming up to the 10th anniversary of Margaret Thatcher's death. Aspects of the Thatcher government should still be looked at by people because they had a point of view and they thought the point of government was to change Britain, to change it permanently. And that's the thing that Tony took from them. And I saw a good argument today that in a funny kind of way that Tony's government was a continuation of Nigel Lawson because it was Tony's government that set the Bank of England free.
The nicest thing I've ever heard said about Tony Blair. As we're talking Lawson, and I could Lawson off all night, but let me just say one thing I always liked. He said to the Telegraph long after he left office, the fact that when she was young, my daughter was known as Nigel Lawson's daughter, and now I'm known as Nigella Lawson's father, pleases me immensely. That is the way that generations should pass.
Well, I think that's
absolutely beautiful.
That's absolutely right. And also the tribute Dominic has paid to him and the affection that Dominic had for his father. I think you do know, and I speak as somebody who's got lots of children, what you want in life is for your children to think well of you when you move on to higher things.
George Bush Sr. was asked in an interview, what are you most proud of? It's twice Vice President, CIA, President of the United States, and so forth. And he said, my children still want to come home.
Yeah, absolutely. And the tributes to him and as he said, of his children. But in terms of going back to his political influence, you mentioned Brexit, but also he got people thinking about the green agenda.
Yes.
And that was really interesting.
Another error.
No, well, hang on.
Because he only got his book published by getting Nigella to get her publisher to agree to do it.
Yes.
Because the publishers were so taken by conventional thinking.
The thing that deserves digging into there, John, is that he never challenged much of the science that people wish to talk about. His point was that the economic harm being done by the desire to act immediately was disproportionate to the threat that was being faced. And the Lawson point that he would always make is that you are arguing that on the basis that it may help future generations, we should denude the current generation of any improvement in their quality of life.
But that's just big fossil fuel adopting the tactics of big tobacco,
which is it was a man having an intellectual position which is different to yours. It was none of those things.
After deny comes delay.
But it wasn't
delay on climate.
Alex is absolutely right.
As we can see, is a disaster. We're now living with climate change.
He never denied it. He just looked at it as an insurance premium. And were you paying the right insurance premium? And the answer was no, almost certainly not. That we're not ready.
We're now paying the price
for this.
Of the fact that we didn't take action.
I think we should look more carefully at what he said, and that we should slow down what we're doing, because I think we're going too fast and we can't afford it, and voters won't vote for it.
Well, a good example of this is the pickle that the British industry now finds itself in, when the Europeans, courtesy of the German pressure, has reversed their position on automotive laws.
Just because the Germans government are dictated to by their car industry doesn't mean that we should be. It was one of the moments where there's two reasons to celebrate leaving the European Union, in my view. One is that we're no longer dictated to by the German car industry, and two, we can do to the farmers what Margaret Thatcher did to the miners.
Good grief. Well, I do like your freedom of thought, at least. But my point was that, in effect, the European Union, which tells us so often that the monopoly of virtue, it speaks to, if there was a North concerned in virtue or a height, they'd be speaking from the North Pole or from Everest, respectively. Very quickly reverse ferreted on cars because of the pressure in Germany. And the British now find themselves with targets that are far short, totally unnecessarily. Yes. The difference that would be made by the British automotive industry effectively committing harikuri would be nothing to the environment. Well, that's a point of view which is a different discussion. But that which is left of it, and we should seek to preserve, hang on to, and improve, right? Voluntarily mutilating it and mutilating car owners in this country would make no difference to global emissions at all. But we need to reflect on the fact that our earlier margins, our earlier requirement to quit the combustible engine is now out of kilter with all of our neighbours.
It's the best thing about the Windsor framework is that I can keep on buying a petrol car from Northern Ireland and bring it in to Great Britain between 2030 and 35.
This was the kind of thing Lawson was pointing to.
Yeah. But let's be absolutely transparent. The 2030 timing for getting rid of internal combustion engine cars was a target introduced by Michael Gove. So Michael Gove policy. But
it's still a bad policy. It doesn't matter who introduced it. It's a stupid policy.
I don't know whether that helps your case or hinders it.
It's a Conservative government policy brought in by a Conservative minister.
We'll achieve it. I'd be absolutely astonished if we.
We won't now.
It's just the sale of new. It's the sale of new cars. That's all.
With the EU changing its position, we won't now.
If you in 2029 you buy a new internal combustion engine car, it can drive for 15 years. So we've got a very long way to go before we take ICE cars off the roads.
The point I was seeking to make was Lawson wasn't arguing your premise, neither am I. He was making the point that the hair shirt position some people wish us to take as a nation and as a civilization is absurd. And Lawson was the first to say, why should you ask this of the Chinese, who are going through this experience where the growth of their middle class is the biggest single transition from penury and a bad quality of life and short life expectancy and bad outcomes and basically anything you can judge to much better standard of life.
Where Nigel Lawson was so important was that he gave credibility and used an 18th century term, bottom, to these arguments, that he gave them an authority that allowed other people to follow him both in economic changes and in Brexit and, crucially, in climate change.
Correct.
And getting the right pace for it. We're going to get back to New York to see if there's any more news from Darren McCaffrey. Have the cars got to the aerodrome yet?
Hello, Jacob. There's one thing one could say about New York. It is definitely never quiet. I didn't quite get the end of your sentence, but I just want to bring you up to date with kind of two things that we've learned that went on in the court that have just come out in the last couple of minutes or so. First of all, we talked a little bit earlier, didn't we, about whether Donald Trump was going to be gagged or not. He is, at the moment, not going to be gagged, but the judge did make it clear that that issue would be revisited if the ex-president continued with his heated rhetoric on social media about the case. He said that there was a risk that the statements could incite violence or be viewed as threatening to prosecutors or witnesses. And in addition to that, we've got a bit more details of what the prosecution are alleging against the former president. This is from Alvin Bragg, who's the district attorney. That's the man who's leading this case against Donald Trump. He says that the people of the state of New York allege that Donald Trump repeatedly and fraudulently falsified New York business records to conceal crimes that hiding damaging information from voting during the 2016 presidential election. He says that Manhattan is home to the country's most significant business market. We cannot allow New York business to be manipulated and to manipulate their records to cover up what he describes as criminal conduct. So that is a sense of where they feel they are. There are 34 different criminal charges against the former US president. The argument the prosecution seem to be making is that in a city like this, particularly in Manhattan itself, that is damaging to the state. Of course, Donald Trump is a New Yorker. He's a man who lived for most of his life here, and he's clearly had a slap on his wrist about those social media posts. The expectation now is, though, that he's going to go off to Florida. He's going to speak to his supporters down there and to the press. I'm sure he'll take to social media too. It'll be interesting to see whether he manages to restrain himself with those posts, given the fact that the judge has said they may well revisit whether he's in violation of breaking the order where he's been told essentially not to tweet out or to post on social media something that may well be judged that could incite violence or hatred towards the prosecutor, the judge, or indeed some witnesses.
OK, but there's no comparable restriction on the prosecutor. The prosecutor seems to be able to spin away as much as he likes, the Democrat prosecutor. Has the judge said anything about what the prosecutor can say?
Well, I'm sure the prosecutor would say, and we haven't really heard from him in terms of statements, that he's factually stating what the case is against the president, rather than essentially destroying the legal process. I mean, it has been interesting that we've heard from the Trump team that they accept that there is a judicial process, that they respect the judicial process. This is from Donald Trump's legal team. Yet at the same time, Donald Trump has branded it a witch hunt, feels that he's been persecuted, and says that neither the district attorney or the judge can be trusted because they're not impartial and all that. So I think there is a dividing line between factually stating what the courts and the prosecutor. No, surely that's
entirely in the eye of the beholder. That in a deeply politicised case like this, the prosecutor saying he's got to uphold the integrity of New York by bringing a political prosecution is just as political as Trump saying this is a witch hunt. But they're Democrats together, so they're just backing each other.
Well, at the end of the day, it is... Well, I mean, you're right. The US is a very different system from what we have, and he was elected as a Democrat. There's no doubt about that. But at the same time, this is a judicial system, and clearly the judge, and indeed a jury, if it gets to that stage, will decide on the legal basis whether he's broken the law or not. Clearly Donald Trump and many others, including Democrats, do think that this is potentially being politically motivated, but that won't decide whether he's guilty or not. I mean, I think everyone would accept that the US has got the rule of law, and that if Donald Trump is found guilty, it will be through a judicial process. So we'll have to wait and see. But Donald Trump is not someone who necessarily holds his counsel to himself. So we'll wait and see what he has to say later on tonight in Florida.
Look, thank you so much for your sterling service, standing out in what I hope is the not too cold. We're going over to California, to Mr. Brodo, to give us some further news on what's going on. Yep. Hello, good evening or good afternoon. What's your insight into Mr. Trump's situation at the moment?
My insight is that this is a continuation of 7 years of attacks by the left on Donald Trump. It's a purely political hit job. Bragg, who is the district attorney in Manhattan, is a terrible figure because he is disrupting the law. He has refused to prosecute felons, and yet he wants to put Donald Trump up as a felon when at best it's a misdemeanor. But it's not even a misdemeanor. There's no crime. No crime has been proven. So the whole thing is totally political, and I think it's going to backfire.
Okay, but who has he refused? Who has he refused to prosecute? And what sort of cases do we know about that he hasn't prosecuted?
It's clear that about 75% of the felonies that are committed in New York City will not be prosecuted. So in other words, they're not going to. If you break into someone's home, they're not going to prosecute you. Prostitution.
Oh, okay. So he doesn't care about burglary, but he doesn't like Donald Trump. Well, we're going to go over to Anthony Scaramucci, the former White House Director of Communications. Mr. Scaramucci, what are your thoughts on today's proceedings?
Well, I just, finished reading. Hello, by the way. I just finished reading the indictment, and I find the indictment to be uninspiring, and I think it's a difficult case to be making against a former president. So just, again, whatever my disagreements are with Mr. Trump, and I certainly don't want him to be president again, I think there is a political persecution that's happening, and I think Mr. Trump is going to win the political side of this narrative. Now, the one problem, as I think every one of your guests know that live here in the United States, it's always a crapshoot with a judge and a jury. So if the case goes to trial, there has to be concern about how it unfolds. And, Mr. Trump may be popular in certain parts of the country, but he's not popular here. And so it's going to be incumbent upon his legal team to find the most impartial jurors as possible. But I don't love the case. I think it smacks up against the rule of law here in the United States. I think it hurts us. I certainly don't want American political leaders building jail cells for their political adversaries and sort of throwing red meat to their constituents by doing that. I think it's a very slippery slope to do that. So whatever my disagreements are with the president, I think it's a specious case, and I'm disappointed at the way those indictments unfolded.
Didn't Donald Trump's supporters chant that Hillary Clinton should go to jail? Isn't he just being bitten by the monster that he let loose in the 2016 election campaign.
I didn't, yeah, and again, sir, I didn't like that either. I don't, you know, and I had that conversation with Mr. Trump. I did 71 campaign stops with him while he was running for president. That whole lock her up sort of stuff, I thought it was hurtful to him. And maybe he is getting the negative refractory karma related to that right now. But again, two wrongs do not make a right. You've got to get the American people believing in the legal system. You and I both know what Cicero once said: we're slaves to the law in order to be free. And you got to be very careful with the legal system. If people feel that it's politically motivated,
I'm going to have to end you there, Ms. Ritchie. Thank you so much for coming on. This draws us and my guests to a close, but we're about to hand over to Dan Wootton. Thank you and good night.
No spin, no bias, no censorship. I'm Dan Wootton, and breaking tonight, a political witch hunt